Okay, welcome to join today's community meeting. For the overall status, first of all, we 1.14 has been released, and besides that, we have identified some issues. So we will fix them and create 1.1.1 patch release. For V 1.15. We are in the state of collecting requirements, and we have also started to review the candidates. So if you have some recommendations for the candidates, you can continue to add the candidate tag to the issue. That's it. And some individual update. I'm working on the data movement service design, and I have added some info about the privilege mode and the root user for the node agent part and the data mover part in the design. And now the design is still ready for review. And I'm also working on V1.14 issue about the maintenance job. And I haven't finished it, but I think there are at least two problems. The first problem is that once there is a running maintenance job, and the maintenance job will not, the completed ones will not be deleted. And actually, we have a default number of 3 for the keep last maintenance job, right? But it is not honored. That is one problem. And the other problem is like I found in some user environments, the maintenance job cannot finish. As you can see here, this maintenance job has lasted for 10 hours. I'm just checking what happened to that maintenance job. That's from my side. And Daniel, please.
Uh, I just fix a bug in RC2 and prepare for 1.14. After that, planning for 1.15.
Okay, thanks. And Shin.
I worked on the 1.14 RCNGA related tasks, including testing and some manual test and the E2E test. That's all from my side.
Okay, thanks. I think that's it. Status update. And now some discussion topics. The first one. So the first one, it's about I think somehow old feature. Calling a changing PVC selected node. So the behavior is something like we allow user to create a config map and to specify a node that a node uh, where the restored PVC or PV will be mounted to. And and it is created by this PR or a node PR. And the original problem is like if a PVC has if a PVC has a selected node annotation, and after restore, if that node does not exist in the cluster, the restore will stuck. And so because the the node doesn't exist, right? So then the cluster doesn't know how to provision the PV, so it will stuck. But so here we but actually as Xun has discovered, this is a very old behavior of from Kubernetes. Actually, from 1.16, this behavior has been fixed. That is, when if the node does not exist, the provisioner will provision the PV and remove the select node annotation. So the original problem has been fixed. We don't need to add this select node annotation. That is one thing. The other thing is this select node annotation doesn't work with the weight or for the consumer volume mode of PVCs because of as the principle of the weight for the consumer, if only there is a node scheduled, the PVC will or the PV will not be bound or will not be mounted to any node. That is the second thing. And the third thing is like when we check this annotation, when we check this annotation from the Kubernetes document, this is more like an output of the scheduler because we can see that the scheduler tool added by the scheduler after it is scheduled the pod, right? So it's not a specification or indication for for how to provision the PV. So from this instruction, look like this PR or this change is more like a hack, right? So we cannot predict that this behavior can work all the time, but for sure, for immediate volume, this the current this one still work for the new releases. I mean the Kubernetes release, but we cannot guarantee that it always happen. So I think that's what we have discovered. So here I want to discuss with you how we just deal with this feature. So we may be able to deprecate it directly because it is never used by the new cluster, or we need to enhance it. At least we need to make clear or how it works with for the consumer mod volumes.
Yeah, I actually think deprecating makes the most sense because I think the most important thing here is that when this was added 4 years ago, it was fixing a bug where Kubernetes would fail to provision. So you had to produce this map for your PVCs to work. Kubernetes fixes that now by just removing it, so you don't need to do that anymore. So but it's it's documented behavior. It's in the API. We can't just remove it, immediately. But we could deprecate it in 1.15 and document that this only works for immediate volumes and does not work or wait for first consumer. But since it's deprecated, we expect to remove this in a future release. That's what I would recommend.
Okay, so here, we can add some clarification in this doc as soon as possible to say that it won't work for immediate volumes, and then we find another time to deprecate it, right?
Yeah, I would say deprecate it in the next release, so that'll be 1.15, but document in 1.14.1, or basically as soon as possible, that this only works, if I'm understanding correctly, this only works for immediate, it does not work for wait for first consumer.
Yeah.
So we need to document the limitation of the feature, and then we need to deprecate the feature in 1.15 because I think I agree. I don't think it's needed anymore. But we just need to be careful about removing it because someone might. I mean, the fact that we have an issue open, it means someone was using it. So we need to deprecate it in 1.15, and then we can remove it in a future release.
Right.
So we should deprecate it in 1.15. We can't remove it until later because we need to give users a chance to stop using it. So deprecate it in 1.15 and then remove it in a future release. Again, we need to revisit that deprecation policy and get that in place because I think the recommendation for the deprecation policy, if we agree with that, would be 2 releases. So that means if we deprecate it 1.15, we probably remove it in 1.17. But again, the deprecation policy needs to really get finally reviewed and put in place to be official there.
Yeah, right. That was a PR, right.
That's my, if anyone else has a different opinion, I'd love to hear it, but that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, I think that sounds good to me. And by the way, when we say deprecated in 1.15, we just update the release node and
Yeah,
the
we have to documentation. I mean, depending on, I mean, sometimes with deprecated features, you know, you can provide ways to warn when they're in use. Maybe if we the plugin itself could, you know, if it finds a mapping when it processes it, it could also log a warning saying this is a deprecated feature and it'll be removed in the future.
Mhm.
That way they'll see that and then a restore warning. That might be helpful. So because they're not going to be doxed necessarily, but if they use the feature, then when they look at the restore, they'll see a restore warning saying this is a deprecated feature that will be removed in a future Velero release.
Sure.
Okay. Then I think the other work is we continue to work on the deprecation policy PR, right? Hopefully.
Yeah, we need to.
merge.
We started that and we kind of got sidetracked, but we need to go back to that because this keeps coming up. You know, there's restic, and then there's this, and then there's other things that we want to eventually, you know, get rid of.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That's from my side, and the other one, Daniel, please.
Could you open that roadmap? Yeah, we've discussed internally about the timeline for 1.15. So this is the proposed timeline. The first milestone feature freeze. After that, we will not allow new big feature to be added into 1.15 roadmap. It's around the end of July. Then around the end of August, that's the feature complete. Then in September, we're gonna hit RCs and the GA in October. That's a general plan. And yeah, we may be delaying the milestone for a couple of weeks, but again, we'll try not to delay too much. I think 1.14 we made some improvement. We delayed 2 weeks for the FC and RC. So yeah, I think we want to make sure we will not delay for more than 2 weeks for the major milestones. Shubham and Scott, what's your opinion on that? I
I
mean,
think
the
this looks
timeline?
reasonable to me. I don't know if Shubham or Wes has any feedback, but I think I don't see any problems with this.
Yeah, looks good actually. Yeah, 1 week buffer. Yeah.
Oh, good. So if that's the case, we're gonna execute based on that. And at this moment, we are triaging the candidate issues and you know, reviewing the designs. And yeah, we can iterate on that till the end of July.
Okay. And the next one, from Scott.
Yeah,
Okay.
and actually, I think right now instead of clicking through to the issue, we can just keep it on. Yeah, keep it on the. I kind of had a summary on the meeting notes.
Okay.
This is an issue that came up in our testing with 1.14 within Red Hat because we've pulled the 1.14 code into OADP and we're testing with that. And one thing we ran into is I know there's some changes made. 1.13 added the fail early for data mover where certain conditions, if the pod was failed or unknown or image pullback off or unschedulable, you know, we would fail early rather than waiting for the 30-minute timeout. And then when 14 added some additional changes around that code. And we're seeing that in some cases, specifically if the storage class is Ceph, we're actually getting data uploads and data downloads canceled due to this unschedulable situation. And upon investigation, I'm realizing that the provisioning process. So right now, Velero creates the PV and the PVC pretty much at the same time. Once the PVC is created, the provisioner then creates the PV and then binds it to the PVC. So before that PV is bound, you have a pod that's in pending state. You have a PVC that's not yet bound. That pod has an unschedulable condition on there because the PVC is not bound. And as soon as the provisioner binds that PV to the PVC, that pod's unschedulable condition disappears and it goes from pending to running. But Valero's code right now assumes unschedulable always means it's unrecoverable. And I think maybe there was confusion at one point because if there's no nodes available, for example, that's also unschedulable. But the confusing part here is that that condition also is there if the PVC isn't bound, and the PVC unbound is often a temporary situation waiting for the provisioner. And I think with AWS, for example, that process happens very quickly. So by the time Velero goes and checks the pod, that PVC is already bound to a PV. But at least in our test environment with Ceph, we're noticing that's taking a few seconds. So we're seeing pretty consistently, not every data upload, data download is going to be canceled, but pretty much if we do a backup and restore with several of those volumes, either in the backup or the restore, in almost all cases, one of those two is going to fail with this error.
I have a question here. So, especially for the restore, I mean the data download. Actually, first we create like a PVC, and then we create first so we have the workload to be restored, and the workload have the pod and the PVC. So we create the workload pod, and we create a workload PVC, and that PVC will wait there until the data download finish. So so here, if the situation just match what you have mentioned, because the pod will not be in the bound state until
so we're talking about the pod. We're talking about the pod in the Velero namespace that the data mover is looking at.
So so what is the difference? Why the pod in the workload namespace doesn't have this unscheduled condition? But
I don't know if it does or it doesn't. We're not looking at that because we don't expect that pod to be running yet. So the issue is that
we don't check it. We don't know. Maybe it's also in the unscheduled condition, right?
Right. I just mean that the data mover pod we check because Velero because right now we have otherwise we have a 30-minute timeout. So that if data mover is not acting by then. So we added code in some of it in 1.13, some in 1.14 to to fail early, so that if the pod is not running, because it can't get the image or because it's failed or whatever reason, we don't wait for that. We say, okay, this pod has failed. It's not recoverable. We fail now. We cancel the data download or the data upload.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing is we're getting canceled data uploads or data downloads when we use Ceph as our storage class.
So you mean whatever state for the workload pod, we don't check it. We don't cancel.
Right. That's not relevant here. I'm specifically talking about the checks we make because Velero creates the data mover pod and the temporary PVC, and then it checks the pod state to fail early if that pod is not going to run.
Yeah,
then those checks failing.
Yeah, from your observation, how long will this scheduled condition take? I mean, does it just take wait there until the pod or the PVC get bound, or it's just a very short time?
It's until the PVC is bound to a PV, and from what I'm seeing, at least in this test environment, it is a pretty short time. It's probably a few seconds. But the problem is Velero doesn't wait for a timeout. As soon as it sees that unschedulable condition, it cancels. So that's why I'm saying we have two possible solutions. The simplest fix, which we just tested just to make sure it worked, which works, but again, we lose that ability for unschedulable pods to fail early. One option is just stop looking for unschedulable. We can, if we just check for image pull back off and failed pods, and we ignore unschedulable pods, it works. I have a draft PR that does that. A second solution, which might be better, is when we check for unschedulable pods, instead of just doing a single check, we could do a pull until context timeout for say, 1 minute or something, shorter timeout than the 30 minutes overall timeout. basically whatever timeout we give it, this is, we think this is the maximum time it'll ever take for provisioning to take. And we pull for that shorter timeout. And if it's still unschedulable after that timeout, then we cancel. But that gives it time for those provisioners that are going to take a few seconds. That might be a better solution. So again, I see these as both valid solutions, but there are different consequences. The easy solution means that if you have pods that are unschedulable because the nodes aren't available, for example, we're going to be timing out in 30 minutes. So that's going to be slow. So that's kind of a downside. The upside is it's simpler. There's no polling involved. The polling approach is a little more targeted. It says, we know that unschedulable is a condition that can last for a little bit longer than immediate, but we don't want to wait the full 30 minutes. So we do a polling for maybe a minute, maybe 2 minutes at most, maybe even less. I'm not sure. We should make that configurable if we add a timeout. And then this will allow the unschedulable situation to work itself out, for over a short period of time. But of course, if we see image pull back off, or if we see failed pods, we still fail immediately.
Yeah, but I just come out of one case. When we create a CSS snapshot from the storage, it takes unknown time to finish it, right? Or actually to have the PV to have the PV go to the bound state, because
Right.
The storage need to clone the data. So it may take 1 minute, 30 minutes, or even 1 hour for some, not good enough storage.
So in that case, maybe we don't want to we don't want to fail early for unschedulable at all. Maybe we just remove that. And that, again, that's if you click through to the issue, and then I have a draft PR that just removes unschedulable as a condition that we're
For this one, right?
Yeah, exactly. With that approach, we basically say we treat unschedulable like anything else. We just wait for the timeout. And that timeout is, I think that 30-minute timeout is configurable. So if we do that, and that because we needed a quick fix on the OADP side, that's actually what I implemented in our own fork. But I was kind of hoping eventually to get a fix upstream so we can, not have to maintain that. That's the simplest fix. That's probably the most reliable fix. It's just that the only downside to that solution is if you have a cluster where nodes are unavailable to schedule, it's going to take longer to fail. But the correctness of the failure is still going to be there. It's just going to fail from timeout rather than failing early.
Sorry, if we say that we never timeout, so or it's better that we have this timeout configurable by user. That is
right. Well, we have the existing timeout.
Yeah.
I mean, the 30 minutes is an existing timeout. This is specifically the fail early code where Velero is saying, hey, if we have an error that we know is unrecoverable, we don't bother to wait for the timeout. And that was the code added in 1.13 and then modified in 1.14, specifically around conditions like image pullback. Image pullback was, I think, where we first hit this, where if originally we were using a different image for the mover pod, and so if that image wasn't available, those pods were never coming up. So we're going to fail early. If the pod is in a failed or unknown state, again, that means the pod's not going to come up ever. So we can fail now. We don't need to wait for timeout. I think that the problem was when this code was implemented, we also assumed unschedulable meant that there was a problem in that there were no nodes available, and then it would never come up. But again, the problem is that's only one reason for unschedulable. We see this temporary unschedulable situation while we're provisioning. So this is a draft PR that does the simple solution, which is just removing that. Okay. If you look at look down, because this is just in the unit test. So basically we remove this condition here. So we're not checking unschedulable. So that's the simple solution. The more complicated solution is to replace that with holding until timeout with some shorter timeout that's configurable, that's different than the 30-minute big timeout. Either one of those has the same result. It's going to now allow this to work because the code that exists in 1.14.0 is basically going to fail most of the time for Ceph volumes.
Okay, just 1 minute.
Sure.
How about this? I think I need some more time to check this offline and
Yeah, that's fine. That makes sense. That's why I created the issue and the draft PR. The PR is a draft because we haven't agreed on an approach yet.
yeah.
So we can discuss on the issue or the PR for now. If we decide that we like the just don't consider unschedulable, then we can turn that PR ready to review. If we want to take a different approach, that's fine too. But let's just take that offline onto the issue that I created, 7898, and discuss that after you have time to look into it.
Yeah, okay. So from your side, I mean, from the OIDP side, it's okay to finally have this in 1.14.1, right?
Yeah, that's fine. And we've already agreed that we have to fix this in our fork and as an interim solution. I've already implemented that option 1 because it's a simpler one, with the idea that once we get the fix upstream, we can remove our fix in the fork. So 1.14.1 is kind of where I'm looking to get this fixed. Let's fix it on main. So if it's in target for 1.15, but then we can cherry pick it to 1.14.1 if we get it fixed in time.
Okay.
Because it's not just an ODP issue. Anyone that's using Ceph with the Velero upstream is going to hit this too.
Yeah. Okay. Let me check this offline and we can
Sounds great.
continue the discussion. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. And any other thing we need to go over here? Okay. Then we can complete the meeting today here. And thanks for joining.
Congrats on the release, everyone.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks for the contribution.
Thank you.
Okay. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.